Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Dear friends, today I want to say a few words about the end of the 12 steps of dependent origination from Upadana, or clinging, to becoming, birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And I also would like to say something about the reverse of dependent arising, with the cessation, the complete cessation of ignorance, comes the cessation of sankharas, and so on, the cessation sequence, which is describing the Arahant. It's describing the third noble truth. And then what we're talking about tomorrow, the spiral path, or the superhuman version of dependent origination, which is a completely different list. You could associate that with the fourth noble truth as being the way leading to awakening. So I'm going to give a little different way of looking at it, with acknowledging Bhante Jnanavira, his notes on the Dhamma, which is a link in the sutta references that I sent you. When you say upadana bhavo, upadana pachaya bhavo, dependent on upadana, dependent on clinging, is becoming, you should take that the fundamental clinging is the holding to the attavada, or the belief in the self. So if you, and that includes what's called self-conceit, asmimana, which is the very, very last thing that goes away for the fully enlightened Arahant. And it also includes the Sakkaya Ditthi, which is, you could say, like an ideology of the self, or like a belief system. We were talking about this before. A worldling takes what seems to be a self at face value, and at least in their own eyes, they and others continue to be a self and a whole lot of self. They would see the self in the five aggregates, as we were talking about before. If you thought the body is the self, or the body is owned by the self, or the body is the essence of the self, and as long as you have that system, you will suffer. When you lose the ideology of thinking and believing that the self is contained in the five khandhas. That would be your stream entry. When you completely get rid of this asmimana, the subtle conceit, you would not even think of I am. While you are a worldling and you see the self in these things, then you could say the words birth and death are applying to you. For the Arahant, who does not even think of I am, then there's no self or even an I for the words birth and death to apply to. And so this is the way that birth and death are ceased, because they're not applicable anymore. One who is a worldling, who take the apparent self at face value, don't even realize that they're a victim of their craving. They don't see that being a self, this is their bhava, they don't see that that their existence is depending on holding a belief in the self. In the Patilama, in the opposite sequence of dependent origination, it's like from the very beginning, with the cessation of ignorance, there's no ground of self for any of these ideas to become attached to apply to. A person could question this and say, well, obviously, if somebody is an arahant, they've not become unconscious. They're not dead. They're still alive, and they still have consciousness, perceptions, Vedana, living body, and so forth and so on. And those things are all true. However, the body, the feeling, the perceptions, the volitions, and so forth, none of those things are connecting to a self. This is explained rather poetically in the story of Kevadha, which is in part of Sutta number 11 in the Digha Nikaya. And I'll add this to you, the Sutta references. Kevadha, the Buddha is speaking to a monk called Kevadha. He said, once it so happened, there was a mendicant in this very Sangha who had the following thought: where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? Then that mendicant attained a state of immersion such that the path to the gods appears. When he approached the gods of the four great kings, he said, Reverence, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? And when he said this, those gods said to him, Mendicant, we do not know this, but the four great kings are our superiors. They might know. Then he approached the four great kings and asked the same question. But they also said to him, Mendicants, we do not know this, but the gods of the 33 might know. So he went there, he was directed onward and onward to different levels of gods. Saka, the Lord of gods, the gods of Yama, the gods named Suyama, the joyful gods, the gods named Santusita, the gods who delight in creation, the god named Sunimitta, the gods who control the creation of others, the god named Vasavati, the gods of Brahma's host. And he approached each one of them in turn and said, Reverence, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over? Namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air. But they also said to him, Mendicant, we do not know this, but there is Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, the wielder of power, the Lord God, the maker, the author, the first, the begetter, the controller, the father of those who have been born and those yet to be born. He is our superior. He might know. But Reverence, where is that Brahma now? We also don't know where he is or what way he lies. But by the signs that are seen, light arising and radiance appearing, we know that Brahma will appear. For this is the precursor for the appearance of Brahma, namely light arising and radiance appearing. Not long afterwards, the great Brahma appeared. Then that mendicant approached the great Brahma and said to him, Reverend, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? And great Brahma said to him, I am Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, the wielder of power, the Lord God, the maker, the author, the first, the begetter, the controller, the father of those who have been born and those yet to be born. For a second time, the mendicant said to the great Brahma, Reverend, I'm not asking you whether you are Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, the wielder of power, the Lord God, the maker, the author, the first, the begetter, the controller, the father of all those who have been born and those yet to be born. I am asking where these four primary elements cease without anything left over. And for a second time, the Brahma repeated the same statement. And for a third time, the mendicant asked, Then the great Brahma took that mendicant by the arm and led him off to one side and said to him, Mendicant, these gods think that there's nothing at all that I don't know and see and understand and realize. That's why I didn't answer you in front of them. But I too do not know where these four primary elements cease with nothing left over. Therefore, mendicant, the misdeed is yours alone. The mistake is yours alone, in that you passed over the Buddha and searched elsewhere for an answer to this question. Mendicant, go to the Buddha and ask him this question. You should remember it in line with his answer. Then that mendicant, as easily as a strong person would extend or contract their arm, vanished from the Brahma realm and reappeared in front of me. Then he bowed, sat down to one side and said to me, Sir, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over? Namely, the elements of earth, water, fire, and air. When he said this, I said to him, Once upon a time, mendicant, some sea merchants set sail for the ocean deeps, taking with them a land-spotting bird. When their ship was out of sight of land, they released the bird. It flew right away to the east, to the west, the north, the south, upward, and in between. If it saw land on any side, it went there and stayed. But if it saw no land on any side, it returned to the ship. In the same way, after failing to get an answer to this question, even after searching as far as the Brahma realm, you've returned to me. Mendicant, this is not how the question should be asked. Sir, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? This is how the question should be asked. Consciousness that's invisible, boundless, entirely given up. That's where water and earth, fire and air find no footing. And that's where long and short, fine and coarse, beautiful and ugly, that's where name and form cease with nothing left over. With the cessation of consciousness, that's where this ceases. So consciousness that's invisible, Vijnanam anidasanam, it's more accurate to translate that as consciousness that's not indicative, that's not pointing to anything. This is the Arahat's consciousness, which is not pointing to a self. This is also the cessation of consciousness, meaning the cessation of a consciousness pointing to a self. And then without the self, there's no ground for any of these other elements or these polarities of long and short, fine and coarse, beautiful, ugly. The polarity of name and form all cease when there's no reference to the self. That is, there's no ground and no contact. This, in a way, you could say is coming back to the beautiful comment that our friend Shirley was making during the questions and answers when she pointed to the meditation on sunyata, the meditation on emptiness. And so this is the meaning of the cessation part of dependent arising. It's not like something that's happening gradually. It's rather that when the ignorance ceases or when the delusion ceases, the self-consciousness ceases, then the whole thing collapses like a house of cards.